Cuphead is one of the more recent video game franchises, debuting on September 29, 2017. Even though there's only a single game in it, it was successful enough to warrant a DLC expansion and even an animated series. The gameplay is classic run and gun, but the aesthetic is where Cuphead truly stands out, being inspired by 1930s era cartoons. Every asset found in the game is completely hand-drawn, and the soundtrack was recorded with instruments prominent in the Jazz Age. Unlike other custom Yu-Gi-Oh archetypes, I didn't necessarily adapt Cuphead's gameplay per se. Instead, the deck focuses on the idea of keeping the glass full as its win condition, i.e., the deck size. For over 25 years in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, no competitive archetype has actively tried to keep its deck size high. Drawing, searching, and milling have always been the order of the day, especially in decks with more than 40 cards. Even 60-card decks can only excel with That Grass Looks Greener and Pot of Desires in their strategy, both of which actively decrease the deck size. The Inkwell Isle archetype's main focus is to keep the player's deck size as high as possible, so a 60-card deck is mandatory. Consequently, there has to be 3 copies of 2 main searchers instead of just 1 to keep the deck consistent. That's what Cuphead and Mugman both do in an Inkwell Isle deck. They're basically the same card but with inverted stats. They both need a lot of cards in the player's deck to do anything. 30 or more give them an extra 1500 attack and defense, 40 or more lets them excavate for another Inkwell Isle card, and 50 or more lets them special summon their brother after a non-cost discard. The 2 latter effects are normal summon only and restrict a player to Inkwell Isle special summons that turn. Both brothers also have a singular fusion monster, which is the boss monster of the deck. It's not a contact fusion, but it's still fairly easy to get on the board. It starts at 600 attack and defense, but gains another 600 attack and defense for every 10 cards in the player's deck. That's a potential 3,000 for 50 cards. It also shuffles cards from either grave, Ishizu Fairy style, if it's fusion summoned with both its materials or special summoned by an Inkwell Isle card effect. When I say both its materials, that means instant fusion won't lead to a quick shuffling. Now, if the player has at least 55 cards in their deck, they can put cards from their hand back to shuffle away the same number of opposing cards. And if this effect ends up putting all 60 cards in the deck, it draws 5 for free. Now, this is part of the effect, so an Ash Blossom can negate it. So putting cards back isn't a cost. It would have been too risky otherwise. Elder Kettle is the only monster that specifically needs a bigger deck than the opponent. So it technically doesn't need a 60-card deck, but it's unlikely to be able to use one of its effects otherwise. It can either put an Inkwell Isle card on top of the deck or excavate the top card of the deck in the hopes of getting one. If the deck is at least twice the size of the opponent's, Elder Kettle gets to do both. Effectively, it searches in a way that Ash Blossom can't disrupt. Now, given the deck size rules of between 40 and 60 cards, it's not going to get both effects on turn 1. But it might be more useful drawing as a late game card. The legendary Chalice is Inkwell Isle's very own Ghost Girl. As long as there are at least 50 cards in the deck, it can shut down mills and runic banishes altogether. This isn't a discard, it has to be sent to the graveyard to work, so don't use Dimension Shifter with it. Speaking of which, if it can't be used, Miss Chalice can make it work anyway. It's a generic level 3 synchro tuner that treats any Inkwell Isle monster as a tuner for its summon, so any other level 1 or 2 non-tuner works great with it. As long as the deck is big enough, she can reveal up to 3 copies of the legendary Chalice to gain effects. It only takes 45 cards to make it a 2400 untargetable beatstick that floodgates any milling and runic shenanigans, so it's a great opening play. Pork Grind can't be used as one of Miss Chalice's tuners because its level is too high. Instead, it's a combo piece that can hit the board with any other Inkwell Isle card. It can recycle an Inkwell Isle card if a different card is sent to the deck, but it needs the quick play spell Economic Emporium to draw it right away. Without it, Pork Rind is probably better as an extra deck material than anything else. Canteen Hughes is a union monster that can equip itself to any of the Inkwell Isle monsters that are playable in the Cuphead game. It makes the opponent shuffle one of their cards on the board into the deck whenever the equipped monster battles. The last monster is a generic rank 2 Ixies, but can also be summoned with any Inkwell Isle monster with a level as the entire material. The Elder Kettle is a 3700 wall if there are 50 or more cards in the deck. It also protects all Inkwell Isle cards, including itself, from being destroyed by card effects while it has an Ixie's material. And once per turn, it can either attach an Inkwell Isle card in the graveyard as material, or detach one to put an Inkwell Isle card on top of the deck. Now for the spells. Economic Emporium is designed to work with core grind more than anything else, but it still helps the archetype without it. It gains effects depending on the player's deck size. With at least 30 cards, it can recycle an Inkwell Isle card. With 40, it prevents the opponent from responding to Inkwell Isle monster effects. And with 50, it turns the normal draw into Pot of Duality without a drawback. The Inkwell Isles is the archetype's field spell, and it prevents Necroface from being mandatory. When activated, it shuffles all banished cards for free. While in effect, it can accumulate porcelain counters every time the opponent activates something, based on how many Inkwell Isle cards it can excavate. It can excavate up to 5 cards with at least 50 in the deck, so a high enough archetype to card ratio could grant a free negate every activation or so. It only needs 4 to negate a card effect, and it doesn't have a once per turn clause anywhere. Seriously, this card is pretty busted, and probably the only real way to justify using a 60 card deck without that Grasshook screener. Joyous Journey is a potential extender that needs at least 40 cards in the deck and an Inkwell Isle monster. It can special summon any excavated Inkwell Isle monster, plus another one with at least 50 cards. It has a special summon class, so this won't help much in hybrid decks. Brotherly Bonding is weird as far as fusion summoning spells go. It's a quick play spell, but the weird part is that it doesn't use fusion materials per se. It just shuffles any 2 monsters with the same type, attribute, and level to special summon a fusion monster that happens to have the same type, attribute, and combined levels. This can't put anything that must first be fusion summoned on the board. It can, however, put most fusion monsters on the board by shuffling the most unlikely monsters, as long as their level is an even number. For example, the level 8 Red Eyes Dark Dragoon can take any 2 level 4 Dark Spellcasters. This is one of the few Inkwell Isle cards that doesn't care about deck size, so it's extremely splashable. The final card is the only trap of the archetype. Rapturous Rejoicing is kind of like a temporary virtual world QB, except it places anything that would go to the graveyard to the bottom of the deck instead of banishment. It can also banish itself to shuffle 1 or 2 Inkwell Isle monsters in the graveyard to put any Inkwell Isle monster from the extra deck or graveyard on the board. Since only one effect can be used per turn, this is a great discard option for Cuphead or Mugman's effect. Oh, and I'm also featuring this ridiculously pointless card. It's not an Inkwell Isle monster, it doesn't do anything, it has no synergy, and its attack and defense are off-kilter. Basically, it's illegal.
Yep, just the way I like it.
That's all 14 cards, not counting that joke card. Now for this video's combo, and it's something that probably occurred to anyone familiar with how to recycle cards. It requires 2, Pot of Desires and the Inkwell Isles. First, play Pot of Desires to banish the top 10 cards to draw 2. Next, play the Inkwell Isles to return all the banished cards back into the deck. It's a +1 in card economy that anyone who's ever played a macro deck should be well aware of. The only real difference is that Necroface isn't necessary and it doesn't waste a normal summon. Terraforming and other field searchers and or Pot of Extravagance can yield the same effect. So even a 60 card deck can pull this off reasonably. Just remember to have the Banish Recycler first. Finding out that the last copy of the Inkwell Isles is banished face down will really suck. Now for the sample deck. And yes, it's a 60 card deck. To keep it consistent, it has 3 copies of all 14 Inkwell Isle cards. 11 of them are main deck cards, so that takes up half the deck already. 3 Kartorhin, the Hidden Gem of the Sea France. It's practically tailor-made for this archetype as a level 2 Water Rock monster, so its potential shuffle card with Brotherly Bonding. Triple Exodius, the Ultimate Forbidden Lord, instead of recycle graveyard monsters. A couple Necrofaces just in case the Inkwell Isles is negated, and True Droll and Lockbirds are self-explanatory. Triple Adamancipator Friends makes it easier to get Cuphead or Mugman from the deck, but it has a non-rock special summon clause. Triple Pot of Desires because of the combo I mentioned earlier. Triple Tactics Thrust helps get to the 1 Terraforming, since the Inkwell Isles is the best interruption card in the archetype. A Triple Tactics Talent is also useful of Thrust. Triple Gordian Schneider if going second, since the banished cards can be recycled anyway. The limited 1-ofs are self-explanatory. The extra deck also has 3 copies of each Inkwell Isle, since Gordian Schneider needs spare banished targets. Outside the archetype, there are few useful tech cards. Gachi Gachi Gantetsu is a rank 2 Ixies rock monster that can be an alternative to the Elder Kettle if necessary. 2 Typhons and Zeus are self-explanatory. Varudras and Blackluster Soldier use the Exodiuses to get on the board. And the side deck is mostly staple cards. Triple Artifact Lancia and Dark Ruler No More are obvious. Small World gives more consistency to a 60-card deck. 3 White Howlings are anti-spell that work with water monsters. 2 Royal Decree are anti-trap. Finally, there's an unusual alternate win condition for the 15th card. Big Inflate Dragon. It's basically a 10,000 attack beatstick if there are at least 50 cards to banish. Yes, 50 from the deck. Small World makes it easier to get into, but it does have to be normal summoned. It doesn't help if Dark Ruler No More is in effect, so it really needs to OTK to be useful. And that's everything. Hope you enjoyed playing with them in customs. As always, feel free to let me know of your thoughts or feedback in the comments. Be sure to like and subscribe if you're interested in more gaming custom cards.